Boom shakalaka, ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, brothers and sisters around the world. It's your boy Krishool, and I thought I would break down this video I came across from the Timcast. It's a podcast that I don't typically listen to, but I do find Tim to be highly perspicacious, has a very knowledgeable, insightful understanding of everything that's going on in the world, and I found this conversation to be so tumultuous that I could not resist getting into a conversational jujitsu breakdown session. So we're going to have a look at this conversation on communism, on whether or not it's a viable system for humanity, and have a look at both Tim Pool's perspective in addition to Ian Crossland, another frequent host on the Timcast. Let's rock it.
Communism doesn't work because it turns into vanguardism. Always. The last two times they tried it in Soviet Union and China, they became vanguardist states. But if they had a real communist state where there is no state and the people just...
That's why I disagree. Ian, you are so
You'd have to have permanent electricity, always attached to the grid, and smart contracts flipping so there's no middlemen.
It's not possible, Ian.
It would be...
All right, so I want to understand the statement that Ian made in this video, because he hasn't said that communism works per se, even though I think later on he says that it can work. But he says it doesn't work because of vanguardism, which is, from what I understand, where a group of people, bad actors, get in control, try to control everything, and they tend to have tyranny, right? Now, you could say communism does not work for many reasons in terms of past evidence, why it has failed in the past. But any kind of system that is based on people working together and sharing resources and no one having outright ownership of any property as such. I mean, I personally do not think that is a good idea. I like the idea of owning shit. But just to be clear, absolutely it is possible to create systems like that. I mean, hell, it was done on Star Trek. And as we know, anything that happens on Star Trek becomes reality. But in all seriousness, in terms of whether or not something is going to work, I mean, as far as actually implementing something like that, having a resource-based economy, so this is something that was tried to, that the Venus Project had been working on to try to create a society where essentially it's based on resources and equal distribution and so forth. Now, of course, that can theoretically work, and I would make the argument that in various degrees it is working. I mean, you can make the argument that capitalism never works and never has worked, purely because within the capitalist society that we have so much communism within it. You can make an argument realistically either way. It just comes down to your definition. Like, it's not 100% capitalism, therefore you could say, hey, well, capitalism has never worked. Or you could say it's not 100% communism, but what we're seeing at the moment, so it's never actually worked. But the reality is we have elements of communism and socialism. I mean, we essentially have a socialist state in the United States and in most states. And to quote Ayn Rand, socialism and communism are pretty much the same. I mean, effectively, socialism tries to create tyranny, control through the vote, and communism does this through force. Now, ultimately, you can have systems that seemingly work, but as to whether or not they're going to be effective in the long run, that's more of a subjective issue. But to make any definitive statement outright that it cannot, will not work, unequivocally, unassailably, definitively, is just not the case. Of course it can work. In terms of whether or not it's going to, I think unlikely it's probably going to, based on human nature, based on the fact that most people want to have their own shit. Most people, when they are put in situations where there's no real incentive to work, my understanding of human nature as it is now, most people would not work in a system like that. And granted that is the case now, human nature is not set in stone. I think one of the false premises people have is that because of human nature, communism will not work. But human nature can change. People can change so much that they become a bunch of sheep willing to do whatever the state tells them to do. I mean, the people of the 21st century are very different to the people of the 20th century and so forth. And granted, there is a tendency we see within human nature. Make no mistake about it. People do change. And in a system where human nature changes so much that people want to work together within a commune, that absolutely can work. And we've seen elements, not to the full extent, arguably, but definitely elements of communism that have worked within the system. And this is coming from someone that is definitely not a fan of communism, is not a fan of any kind of force. And that being said, in terms of communism outside of force, a system where people just agree to it. So let's say a libertarian communist system. So essentially, libertarianism within the moral sense, no force, no fraud, voluntary exchange, people just working together, agreeing to live within a particular area where everyone shares the resources. Of course, that's possible. All that's required for that is for people to make the decision to do that. As to whether it's a good idea, as to whether the resources are going to be sufficient, I mean, it is absolutely technologically possible that, like in Star Trek, we can reach a point where we have abundant resources. We can essentially create food and everything we need to thrive based on the technology. And I think we are reaching that. We're on the verge of the technological singularity. And I think it's only a matter of time until we move towards that. And probably we are moving towards a more communist society, a resource-based economy, or a universal income being set in stone. But anyway, they're my thoughts on it. But let's hear what Ian and Tim had to say in regards to this.
Be such a hard thing to do.
But Ian,
there's no way to create a self-sustaining terrarium of Earth. Communism
right, and
doesn't
that's
work.
the ideal. That's why it doesn't work. It turns into the small group running everything.
There is no way to create a self-sustaining terrarium of Earth. Technologically, of course it's possible to do that. I mean, the lack of imagination some people have is something that I find astounding, just because it hasn't, at least in our knowledge, our understanding of history, it hasn't been done effectively right now. Of course, it's like people saying it's impossible to have artificial intelligence. There are some people that said that not that long ago. And in all humility, I was actually one of the people that would say that there'd be certain I couldn't see artificial intelligence doing X and Y in terms of being so creative and so forth, and I have been blown away. And now we are on the verge of AGI, artificial general intelligence, where all of this kind of stuff, in terms of having essentially technology, robots that can do everything that human beings can do, and it can essentially sustain themselves through resources such as the sun and the many other technologies that we have at our disposal, and we can obviously maximize the efficiency of this kind of stuff. A lot of people make the argument that solar power is just not practical in this day and age, but it's becoming far more efficient. We're finding other forms of renewable energy and so forth, and even groundbreaking technologies that seem to defy the understanding of physics as we have it, like Maxwell Chikumbutsu. A lot of people think that his technology, his device, his microsonic energy device is fake, but we're starting to see that things like that may not be built of air and imagination. And there's a lot of evidence showing that these are actually sustainable technological devices that could be self-sustaining, and it could essentially fuel this resource based economy. So this idea that it cannot be possible is none other than a lack of imagination. Anytime we are speaking about the future, what is possible technologically speaking, I always err on the side of passion. Absolutely, it is possible. Just because we haven't seen something up till now, does not mean it's not possible. I think more than likely it is going to be very possible. I'd say probably within our lifetimes.
It's not just that. Communism is wrong about the core assumptions with respect to human nature and human evil. It asserts that the reason people do things improperly or do things wrong or like commit moral crimes is because of resource scarcity. And reality is just this combination lock. And if we arrange material things in the proper way, we'll unlock the gates of heaven and it'll be utopia. But the reality is there was no poverty in the Garden of Eden. People sin even when they have everything they could possibly need. You could create the perfect communist utopia. People would still murder each other.
I agree with all of that in the sense that, yes, there are these core assumptions that are made about communism that are fundamentally wrong. But as I keep saying, that whereas human nature is, as it stands, such that I would say most people just don't behave in the best interests of the commune. They have their self-interest, and that's my contention. The idea that cannot change, that human nature is so fixed that people cannot change, I mean, that is an opinion. And if anything, history has shown us time and time again that people are often a product of their environment. And if you change the environment enough, people can change. And that's a contention. To say that is impossible is absolutely unequivocally, unassailably false, that it cannot change. Like somehow people cannot change. As individuals, 100% can change their mentality towards things. By extension, humans, groups of people can do the same thing. To make the argument it is not possible for people to do that, that's the issue that I take with that kind of argument. Everything that Tim and his guests are saying in regards to communism, and it's so weird because I feel as if I'm defending communism here. I'm not a fan of it. I'm just not also a fan of bad arguments. And if you make a definitive argument like that it's impossible, well, you need to be absolutely certain. You need to be saying something like 1 + 1 can never equal 3. You can't be saying things like it's never possible that we will have a nuclear war, or it's never possible that that human beings will change their nature and work together in order to create a self-sustaining economy and a resource-based. I mean, stop it. Just stop it. In terms of what is possible, of course it is possible. What would be better to say is you just don't think it's likely because of the core assumptions that are made by communism, which I tend to agree with. But that being said, people can and do change.
People would still rape.
Oh,
people
wait,
would still fornicate.
Let me add to that. The story, I've told this before. My friend from Ukraine, at her apartment, said she was in an apartment, and she said, you want to hear a funny story about that apartment? During the Soviet era, with Ukraine under control of Soviets, there were 2 families that lived in these apartments. They didn't like each other. So one family called the police and said, I heard that family talking bad about the party. The next day, the apartment was cleared out and gone. Yeah. They didn't do that because there was an actual monetary dispute or resource scarcity. They just plumb didn't like the other person because this is how people can be.
That's totally
okay, that's true. This is how people can be, but you can't use that scenario as a representation of how all people are going to be. What's interesting is you have a look at different societies. I mean, for instance, Japan, you have a look at what goes on in Japan when there's a great disaster and how people tend to line up in perfect queues waiting to get some kind of compensation or to address issues that they have. That's something that goes on in Japan. That's a product of their society, their environment. You have a look at what goes on in the States, in a place like Harlem or many of these cities, most cities in the United States. And usually when you see these massive disasters, you see riots, you see people looting and people behaving very badly. Clearly, there's a distinction in terms of human behavior in these two environments. To say because something happens within one environment, therefore it's supposed to represent everything else, is not accurate. What you'll find is that different societies tend to behave differently because human nature is far more malleable than most people think it is. And the flaw in Tim's thinking here is, whereas I tend to agree with everything he's saying, that generally speaking, yeah, what he's saying is true. If you're making the statement definitively that communism will never work, not based on its assumptions, because its assumptions, I think, at present are not accurate. That's more of a subjective opinion. But you cannot have a society that is essentially working collectively together in order to achieve goals where you share resources and so forth. That just requires people to voluntarily do that. And that just requires there to be enough abundant resources. Though the first is absolutely possible, that's just a product of will, enough individuals wanting to actually work coexistingly together. And the second is just a requirement of technology. Absolutely, it is possible to create an environment like that. And we're reaching the point where that is possible. If you're saying it is impossible, it's because, one, you're ideologically biased, or you just lack the imagination to perceive a society that could actually create that through technology. And anytime you bet against what is possible in terms of human innovation, you'll find that you're on the wrong side of history. That's something that you'll find.
Totalitarian states. But that's the problem with vanguardism, is it's totalitarian, and they'll
no,
use fear.
Ian.
Yeah. But in a real communist state,
no. Listen, I'll put it simply. If I am told that doing extra work will net me nothing, then I'm not going to do the extra work.
But what if you like it?
Yeah, that's you, Tim, and I'd actually agree with that for the most part. I think most part. Definitely applying this to myself, whereas I can see that applying to me for the most part. I would make the statement that most people would definitely work under that mindset, at least within the environment that I live in. But it would be completely insane for me to say that everyone works under that mindset. There are a lot of people that do things because they want to help other people. Not everyone is wired the same way. And this is one of the biggest downfalls to when people make assertions like this. They project their own understanding of a reality based on what they would do and what the people around them would do. People are different. People want different things. For crying out loud, some people want to go out and become musicians like Ian here, and some people want to go out and make lots and lots of money. Some people want to go out and fuck beautiful women, like myself, and others want to go and fuck roosters. So, like, the idea of trying to understand how people are going to behave in a general sense, yeah, you can do, but in a definitive sense, you cannot do.
So, what do I get for this is a false assumption about what you like. Some people might like, okay, I'll put it this way. I like talking on camera and doing shows. I do a consistent number of shows because I know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. If someone came to me and said, you can go ahead and record 4 shows per day, but you're not going to be able to expand your business or do anything else, I'd be like, okay, well then I'll do 1 per day and go hang out with my family. There's literally no reason to do it. You can do it as much as you'd like to, but most people, I'll put it this way. Let me just pause. Ian, do you like playing guitar?
I do.
If you had the option, would you choose to have that be your career?
One of my careers, yeah, at least for a period of time.
No, not one of your. Someone said, Ian, sign this contract. You will play guitar, and we will pay you a salary, and that's all you'll have to do.
Nothing else. You'll never be allowed or able.
Yeah, that's not realistic.
You'll have hobbies, but your job is to play the guitar. Yes or no?
I'd say yes.
Of course.
I would look at the contract.
Do you think there are a lot of people who would do that?
Oh, a minority of people, but a large minority of people. Yeah, I think.
You think it's a minority of people that want to be
2 to 6% of the population would say yes to something like that, but that's a lot of people.
So,
guitarists,
of the people who play guitar, how many do you think would take
all of them? Probably.
And do you think all of them have the ability to do that?
No. And
of course,
like 1% of them.
That's why communism doesn't work.
Because it takes away capitalists.
Because some people shouldn't be guitarists.
That's okay. Tim is making the assumption that in order for communism to work, people need to be of service. People need to essentially be productive. But given a situation where, like with the Venus Project, resource-based economy, where it's not based off of mutual exchange, we don't have a system where people exchange their resources for labor and so forth. People are just automatically given everything they want. Like in Star Trek, and this is the idea within Star Trek, essentially, we've reached a point, technologically speaking, where people have enough food to survive. I mean, you have replicators, for crying out loud. In terms of abundance, you can have everything you want. And that absolutely, I know a lot of people disagree, but it is absolutely possible. It is possible through technology to achieve something like that. In a situation like that where people can be essentially given everything they need, you'll find, I would make the argument that people's motives for doing things would change. People wouldn't be interested in, let's say, making lots of money per se, but they'd be more interested in doing things that are fulfilling to themselves. Therefore, this whole assumption of Tim that, oh, wait a sec, in order to survive, you need to be productive. If you suck at something, you're not going to get anything from it. Therefore, communism wouldn't work, is a false assumption. And this is not an opinion per se, right? Given a situation, the one assumption I am making here, right, is that it is possible to have a society where there's tremendous abundance, technologically speaking. I am saying that is possible. And I would say that most people that have an understanding of technology would agree with that. I could be wrong, but I absolutely don't believe I could be. In fact, I could not be wrong in that. It is absolutely possible that given that there is a continual matriculation to higher levels of technology, there's a technological singularity, and we're continuing to grow in more understanding of the universe, and we gain access to better resources, 100% it would be possible where the vast majority of people, everyone has an abundance. It is absolutely possible to achieve that. Based on that, this idea that it is not possible to have a communist society, a society where people are working together, is absolutely false, based off of a system of sharing resources and being able to have enough to survive. I mean, the only reason that you would not think something like that would work is because, once again, you were overly biased towards the ideology, which I tend to be, but not to the point where I am against the idea of technology overcoming many of the problems that are currently facing the globe. Or you just have this worldview that human nature is such that humans will never work together, which is the viewpoint that I believe Tim has.
And these communists are like, once communism's attained, I'll go live on a farm. No, you won't. You'll break rocks and you'll enjoy it.
Even shitty
One of my
guitars
favorite-
Speaking about what people will and will not do in terms of, like, yeah, generally speaking, but it's a very slippery slope if you start making assumptions like that. Oh, no, you'll do this because I know how you are. You're a human being and I fully understand human psychology. Stop it. Stop it. There's a tremendous arrogance, interestingly enough, making the statement that communism definitively will work in the current system, right? Like, you know it's going to work, because it can work, but it's not a definitive. But there's also a tremendous amount of arrogance in saying that communism can and never will work because of X, Y, and Z. I mean, it absolutely can work. It just doesn't work. But both outlooks are being completely extreme and not accepting the fact that, yes, in terms of possibility, yes, of course it can work.
The AI algorithm in a communist state, like,
one of my favorite memes is somebody
can't.
posted, like, what would your job be after the communist revolution? And someone posted anti-communist guerrilla fighter.
like in a real communist state, there is no state, there is no communist. It's just a thing where we
The
all.
withering away of the
It's not
state
possible.
was the dream of
Ian.
Marx, but it's never anything like it.
Marx was all about the
Ian's-
constant
Ian,
overthrowing of.
You're correct.
Different.
In communism, there's no state, and also in Candyland, there are candy canes grow.
Right. Communist.
What's interesting is that Tim is actually being completely lacking imagination here. You know, it's like I am so, and it's kind of like a form of brainwashing, because you're so tied to the way things are, the way that things have been, that it is impossible for you to see a future where something can be. And this is a lack of imagination. And this is one of the fundamental evils that I think befalls most ideologies, right? The lack of imagination. It's one thing to deny reality, which a lot of people tend to do, which is very, very dangerous. But to deny within yourself the ability to imagine what is possible is just as dangerous. And I think a lot of people do that when they deny the idea that, yeah, it is possible to have a society where people are not wired the same way that they are wired now. Unless you have the mindset that human nature of people is set in stone and we can never change. And that is how things have been, and that is how things will always be. But for those of us that are not so set in stone when it comes to our worldview in terms of what is possible, the idea of a society, I think it's unavoidable. I think if there is a natural progression of technology and we are moving towards a higher level of consciousness, absolutely. There is only freedom. Ultimately, people can choose to live whatever lives they see fit. If people or groups of people want to come together and work together collectively and they have an abundance of resources, there's no reason to suggest that cannot happen, unless you're defining communism in such a rigid way where it's just impossible to be anything outside of your worldview of what it means to be human.
Communism is ideal. It is an ideal, but you can get closer
RFK
to
hates Candyland, bro.
Because
He's
the
like,
thing
we
about
need to
the
invade.
U.S. is
We need to invade Candyland.
limited
Destroying
government.
us. That's his
Cut
fentanyl.
down the candy
That's like
canes.
his Mexico. We need to build a wall around Candyland. It's like his version of Mexico.
we always wanted like less government.
I really wish I was in the room there with Ian right now, because it feels like they're ganging up on him here. And I think he's actually the most realistic in terms of understanding why this thing is not working, but also the most inspiring in terms of the fact that, yes, this stuff is possible, and he's opened his mind to the possibility that, yeah, we can actually have this society flourish, as opposed to Tim and his friend there that are completely shut out in this worldview where things are as they are and they can never be anything else. That's a lack of imagination, which is one of the most unfortunate mindsets to befall any great thinker.
Communism is essentially
'cause of the
the
fentanyl that
most
comes into
successful
southern borders.
oligarchy imaginable.
What is?
Communism is the most successful oligarchy.
That's vanguardism.
Yeah,
That's
it's a similar kind of thing. That's what it does.
They say it's
I mean,
communism. They get people excited, and then they betray them and make a vanguard.
No,
On a
no,
deeper level,
no,
like
they
I'm
don't.
saying,
Every time.
It's not
No,
just
they
about the
don't.
structure. It's not just about the structure. A lot of times when the right critiques communism, it'll talk about why
Okay.
it doesn't work economically. But like the actual core claims of communism are just not
Let me
true.
try this. Let me try this for Ian. Candylandism always devolves into a bunch of rotting sugar in a cornfield. And the response is, yes, because Candyland's not real. So when you say communism turns into vanguardism, it's like saying Candyland, bro. Communism can't...
That's an absolutely ridiculous analogy. I mean, you're saying something like Candyland. Okay, so what's your assumption of Candyland? To have a society where essentially candy grows from the ground? Well, it's possible to do that. Well, you could genetically engineer a kind of fruit or sweet that is so sweet it tastes like candy. I mean, open your mind, Tim. Where's your imagination? To say something like that is impossible is just a lack of imagination once again. But besides the point, I mean, to say that you see that as being impossible, therefore this idea, this worldview where people essentially working together, outside of force, mind you, which is still within at least my understanding of communism, unless you're being strict with the definition under Karl Marx and so forth and so. But just in a very general sense, like people essentially working together, forming a commune, a community, a common having common unity with each other, agreeing voluntarily to share the resources and so forth. Yeah, I could do that right now. As to whether or not it's a good idea and it's going to be sustainable in the long term, that's the real question. But in a society where, once again, we have abundance of resources, it is absolutely possible.
Exist. It's. How about this?
I know.
I propose a government where everyone grows wings and flies around.
Red Bull.
Well, it's kind of like
with that. Let's look
we
into
have a
Red Bull.
limited government in the United States.
That's completely stupid. I mean, granted, I would still say it is possible to grow wings, genetically speaking, and fly around. But one has more to do with a scenario which is far more unrealistic, and another, a scenario which just hasn't happened yet, but is absolutely far more realistic because it deals more with nature. And in terms of changing human nature, I think it's difficult to do, but it's definitely something that is far more achievable than, at least, or maybe not, make growing wings. You know, we always have these ideas of what is possible once again, but it always comes down to whether or not you're going to get rid of the scaffolding that prevents you from having these thoughts into terms of what is achievable. And there are very few things that are not achievable in this Euclidean meat-space reality. So with that, anything can be achieved.
Unstoppable tide, the Red Bull Army.
Communism, they always tell you, like, hey, even more less government. We'll have even less government.
Yeah, well,
we'll have no government.
But I hear you. But here's a point that I'll make, and just I'm curious what you think of this. So, one thing that communism absolutely needs on a global scale, not just in one family or one community or one country, even on a global scale, it requires everyone to have the exact same values and interests. Now, just think about this for a second.
Except the leaders.
Even in a family, well, yeah, but we're talking about their fantasy version. Yeah. Even in I won't ask about your family on air.
Seamus.
But no. But I'm just curious about, like, if you have had siblings or know anyone with siblings.
Yeah.
Your sibling is more genetically similar to you than anyone you're going to meet, and you're raised in the same house, in the same area, in the same environment, and even siblings are so radically different. So if siblings can't even be raised with such similar genetics and such a similar environment and being born at such a similar time to be similar people, how on earth could we re-educate the entire globe into accepting communism?
I don't think we need to be...
First of all, we wouldn't need to do that. I mean, you could still have systems, laws in place to punish people that violate certain rules within any society, and you could apply that with a current society. Like, obviously not everyone has the same values and so forth. Therefore, I could say capitalism doesn't really work. But the reality is, within some extent, it does work. And just because, as long as the majority of people are on board with something, you could see this thing working enough so much that you'd say it's thriving. But this idea that unless everyone has exactly the same worldview, it's not. All you need is enough people that share the same worldview or similar enough worldview where you can actually form a commune and work together. And then if they don't have this worldview at hand, obviously you can either cut them out or it doesn't work. But to say that it can't work because not everyone's going to have the same worldview, well, of course not everyone's going to, for the most part, have the same worldview, at least initially, but that can allow them to form other systems, like capitalist systems and so forth. But all is really required for any kind of system to work voluntarily is for enough like-minded people to get together and to create that system. And one of the things we've learned about human nature is that human nature is vast. People always say that this is the normal way of behaving. We have very left-brain people, right-brain people, artistic people, engineers, sociopaths, politicians, one of the same. But all that's really required is for enough people, enough like-minded people to get together and to try to make something work. Not everyone has to be aligned in the same worldview. But I would agree that in order to see something like a communist society flourish, you need to have enough people having that worldview in order for it to work realistically. But society can change. The idea that it cannot, human nature is set in stone, has nothing to do with whether or not you're ignorant in regards to the evils of communism or capitalism, but just has to do with you having a worldview where you think it is impossible to change yourself. And by extension, you apply that to the world, that people cannot change. I can change. And by virtue, knowing that I can change, and that I'm not so dissimilar to other human beings, I know that other people can change their nature as well. The only nature is to not be constrained by your nature. Or rather, the only human nature is that we have the ability to change our nature over time. Whereas we see that this way that we are behaving because we've been doing it so long, is the only way, therefore it must be ingrained within us. What we've learned historically is that things change. Not that long ago, people thought that slavery was just natural. There was no other way. Not that long ago, people thought that it was just the way things were to perform infanticide. I could list hundreds of different practices around the world where people think that this is just nature. But the reality is people can and do change. And by virtue, you can create societies where enough people have a worldview that is in common that you can actually allow something like communism, as ridiculous as it may seem, and I'm definitely not a fan of it, at least within the sense where you try to force people to get in line with what you're doing. I don't think it's definitely not moral. And in terms of just feasibility, practicality, having everyone work together as one, realistically, most people, I don't think, in the current system are not going to work within that system. But to say it's not possible is absolutely, unequivocally, definitively false. But anyway, they're my thoughts on that. This was a very interesting video, but I thought I would just give you my general thoughts on it. Let us know in the comments below what you think about capitalism, what you think about communism, why they can or cannot work, the evils of them, the false assumptions, the communist or capitalist societies that are classic examples of what can actually flourish within a society. But until next time, as I always say, remember there are three things that cannot remain hidden for long: the sun, the moon, and the wisdomatic truth bombs of yours truly, Krishool, aka the Esoteric Noetic. Signing out, your boy. Peace!
I don't even care where this road leads. All I know is when my heart is God with a tree. We believe in, throw my hands up, touch the ceiling. I don't even care where this road